Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Astrologer Climate Witness tonight. I am covering a geologic fact here tonight. The term basically, and it has to do with energy, the term is peak oil. Oil, astrologically speaking, I read years ago, was ruled by Neptune and Pisces, having to do with liquid, but also it's ruled by Pluto, being that it comes from underground. Okay. Also, coming off petroleum are gases, which definitely are ruled by Neptune and Pisces. So, I think this is an important topic. In the United States chart, Pisces is in the third house, intercepted. I don't do whole sign astrology. And the reason I don't, I'm going to cover this here now. I might have done this in the last video, I'm not sure. But if we do mathematical calculations to find out the positions by degree of the sun, moon, and all the other planets, why wouldn't we do that for house cusp? Why are we just going to pretend they don't exist? And people say, oh, well, that means everybody in the very extreme latitudes, their charts have like 3 interceptions. I'm like, so what? Their experience of the physical world is extremely different than someone on the equator. So of course, just because we have trouble interpreting it, we're just going to throw that part out and say, oh, let's just pretend it's whole sign. Sorry. It just doesn't fly with me. Someone born at the extreme latitudes, they have to adapt their existence according to the physical world. So their life is very different in some ways, and it changes their personality. Whether we want to admit it or not, it makes certain things a little more difficult to express. Maybe that's some of the interpretations of interceptions. Okay, having said that, let me continue here. So, let me help if I put my glasses on. Okay, peak oil. Why a peak and fall in oil extraction is inevitable by B. That's what he calls himself. You can go to medium.com and you can follow B or many other authors on various subjects, even astrology. Yes. Okay. There is an increasing amount of evidence that we are close to, or most likely have already passed, peak oil supply. But why is this so hard to tell? How can people argue that there is no such thing at all, while others keep warning us about an imminent decline in oil production? What is peak oil anyway? How do we know if such a thing exists? And if it does, when will it arrive? Well, in order to understand what peak oil is, or a maximum daily petroleum output which could be no longer surpassed ever, we have to become familiar with some basic concepts. Let's start with some very basic ideas and move towards ever more complex topics, all of which I tried to keep as simple as I could. Earth has a finite volume, as every sphere or body in physics has, and thus cannot hold an infinite amount of any liquid. This means that, at least in theory, we can put a finite number on how many barrels of oil can be extracted from this planet. Earth is not a bonbon filled with oil. You can't just stick the straw in anywhere and get some. Petroleum can only be found in specific locations where conditions were ideal for large amounts of dead marine organisms, such as plants, algae, and bacteria, to accumulate. Over the millions of years and under the weight and heat of Earth's crust, this graveyard of dead plankton was turned into a solid mass of organic matter mixed with sedimentary rock. Oil then slowly seeped from this so-called source rock into the underground reservoirs, porous or cracked rock formations, from where it can be extracted. Geologists are fully aware of this process, and by studying Earth's ancient history, they also know where to look for oil and where not to. More often than not, exploration companies end up with dry holes, and relatively few of their good finds turn out to be a valuable reserve which can be tapped later at a profit. Oil is brought to the surface by drilling into these reservoirs. At first, pressure from underground rock formations are enough to force oil to the surface. Pressure from underground rock formations are enough for it to just come up all by itself. But later, pumps must be installed to haul the remaining petroleum. At later stages, CO2, water, or even seawater, must be pumped underground to keep up the flow of oil. As a result, however, the substance brought up will contain more and more water, increasing the so-called water cut. That's an important term. Beyond a certain point, or above a certain water cut, it simply takes too much pumping to get the last remaining barrels of petroleum and the well gets plugged with some oil still left in it. As a result, each well has a production curve, rising fast in the beginning, then peaking and finally slowly falling to zero, like the bell curve, okay? In case of shale, or more precisely tight oil, this process is even more pronounced. Okay, remember that. We're talking about a bell curve here. When a well is first drilled and the oil comes out up all by itself, you get a lot of production all by itself without putting much into it. But then you have to put more energy in to get the oil out because you're pumping. And then at the end, you're taking excessive steps to get the last bit out. Adding water, CO2, yes, pushing it down for the oil to come back up. All of that takes energy to do. Obviously, we are pumping oil at a much faster rate than wells get replenished from the source rocks. Thus, we must keep drilling newer and newer wells every year to keep oil flowing into the economy. As one well or an entire reservoir runs low, a new one has to be tapped. This happens on a daily basis. Some wells run dry and some just get started. There is a fine balance between the two. As long as there are more wells with more output starting to produce than starting to run on empty, we have a growing global oil production. Okay? If, on the other hand, we could not drill as many new wells or stop drilling altogether as proposed by some activists, oil extraction would fall precipitously as older wells run out one after another. In order to keep up with the natural decline and in order to ensure oil production year after year, we must thus have an inventory of oil reserves. Oil is not located in one single large interconnected reserve, though, but in some bigger and an almost innumerable amount of smaller reserves. We have discovered most of our oil fields. We have discovered most of our oil fields, the super large ones, already in the middle of the 20th century, and mostly made adjustments as to how much oil these formations contain or how much can be economically recovered ever since. We have long passed peak discoveries, or the year when we have discovered the most oil. We've surpassed that. What amounts to our findings these days barely covers a quarter of the world's annual consumption. Get that? Okay. What amounts to our findings these days barely covers a quarter of the world's annual consumption. The new discoveries. We found some, but they're not enough. They don't cover much of anything. The fact that discoveries turn out to be just as bad as predicted 20 years ago shows that it is possible to calculate the discovery rate rather accurately based on a scientific method called the creaming curve. Burning more oil than gets discovered or replenished means that we are living up our savings account, accumulated mostly in the 1950s and 60s. Sooner or later, every economically accessible oil field will get pumped dry, with costly to recover dregs of oil left behind in poorly plugged, then abandoned wells, leaving a ticking ecological time bomb for future generations to deal with, beyond the climate change caused by all this burning frenzy. Anyway, one day our entire savings account will run down to zero, but not now, nor in the near future. That is not the point here. If we have a finite amount of material, which fails to magically replenish itself overnight, then its consumption cannot grow indefinitely. Consumption cannot grow indefinitely. Okay? This is a mathematical certainty rooted in physics, not a theory. It follows that there must be a peak rate at which we extract this substance somewhere between the first discovery and when the last drop leaves the last wellhead. In theory, we could grow extraction up to the very last day and then run out of all the oil the next morning. Sadly, this is how far thinking about future supply goes these days. In practice, though, this is entirely impossible due to the nature of extraction explained above. The process of rise, peak, and fall of global oil production is a sum of individual wells rising and falling, as well as fields being added then retired. If oil is finite, which it is, and production from individual wells rise and fall, which it does, then peak oil must happen at a certain point in time. The only question up for debate is, when will that happen? There are two factors to consider when trying to estimate peak supply. One is that we humans always pick the lowest hanging fruit, or tap the easiest and cheapest to drill reserves first, then move on to the increasingly harder and harder to tap ones. No one in their sane mind would start building floating rigs capable to drill into reserves under thousands of feet of water and rocks when one still has a gusher on a nearby land, in parentheses, a shallow well from which oil spurts like a fountain. This low-hanging fruit principle is perfectly reflected in the energy invested in bringing a barrel of oil to the surface. In the good old days, it took 1 barrel of oil, in terms of energy content, to bring 100 barrels of oil to the surface. Now, 1 barrel brings up only about 15 or less on average. Drilling for oil will thus take ever more materials and energy as we move forward in time, raising the cost of drilling and the cost of a barrel of oil higher and higher. We have drilled all the easy to tap large reserves first, and now what is remaining is increasingly smaller and harder to get. We would need to drill more and more wells at a higher and higher energy cost to maintain the same level of petroleum output. As we run out of easy to extract oil, though, we will reach a point where it would take more energy to get a barrel of petroleum than what we would obtain by refining it and filling it into our tanks. At this point, oil would stop being an energy resource and drilling for more would no longer make sense. The other factor in determining peak supply is economics. The number of wells drilled at any given time is a result of a cost-benefit calculation based on the cost of drilling and the long-term expected price of oil. This is not to say that as long as the price of oil is rising, This is not to say that as long as the price of oil is rising, production will rise just the same. This is not to say that as long as the price of oil is rising, production will rise just the same. As we have seen above, at a certain time in the future, it will be meaningless to grow production as it would cost more energy than what we could get in return. What this cost-benefit calculation helps us to understand is why we have multiple peaks and why it is extremely hard to predict when we have passed the final highest peak. There is a limit to what the economy can pay for a barrel of oil, though. At a certain point, which we might have already passed, new oil will become too expensive for buyers to buy, and at the same time, too costly for producers to extract. As the amount of money, energy, and raw materials spent on oil increases, so will the cost of growing food, mining metals, and transporting goods do, as oil is still used to power all these activities. This will continue to fuel inflation and leave even less money in people's pockets to spend on driving around or shopping for consumer products, including solar panels and electric vehicles, all made with the use of oil. Demand would falter as a result, leaving more and more oil for the richer parts of the world to buy. And while overall global supply may fall in response of faltering demand, demand. So will the price of oil do, preventing any new investments to be made in replacing old wells. Okay? With all that said, I give you some time to digest this information. I let you do your own research and perhaps ponder the logical consequences of these fundamental concepts. What are the possible ramifications? How will the future after peak oil look like? What will we do when we indeed reach a zero energy return scenario? These will be the topics of the second part of the series. Okay, I have that. I'm going to read it. But this is just to further the explanation of many issues and problems we have on this planet right now. We have a problem of energy, not just that it's polluting and pushing out CO2 into our atmosphere, but also that there's 8 billion of us, which is extremely overpopulated. Everybody wants to live at least like the average American. And then also, we have the fact that oil is needed to make our renewables if we wanted to do that. I, particularly, am very conflicted about renewables. We're going around the world and making mass mining projects so that we can power useless products, the manufacture of useless products, and useless activities. We got to stop thinking humans are the most important thing in the world. I mean, yes, do we want to try to save and help people? Of course. But the way to do that is not trying to prop up the current economic system and culture that we have now. The way to do that is to stop and reduce the demand, not through, oh, let's make more energy efficient appliances. No. We need to stop ridiculous activities and stop making ridiculous products. That's like what you call degrowth. Okay? All right, let's go to number 2. All right, part 2. And where did it go? It's right here somewhere. Pretty far back. I send a lot of articles to myself on Messenger. Then that way I can go back and read them when I need to. I prefer to print things out, but it just gets, and I'm out of ink again already, so. Okay, part 2, the Spectre of Peak Oil, part 2, ramifications, the long-term consequences of peak oil. Now remember, this all reflects back to Pluto and Capricorn, and yes, I'm still talking about it, because, why does it say that? Okay, because that's what we're going through. People, it's a big deal, because we're not just talking about the collapse of, like, in ancient history, they talked about the collapse of the Mayans or the collapse of a particular region, civilization in a region. We're talking about globally here, okay? Okay, here we go. Peak oil is not the end of the world, okay? It is a subtle, almost barely noticeable phenomena. It does not mean that we will run out of oil from one day to another, causing all transportation to stop, bringing about famine, chaos, riots, and nuclear meltdowns everywhere. We will get there in due time, make no mistake, but not at the time of peak oil supply. It takes a while for everything to come down the other side of the curve, okay? Why all the fuss? And I will add this. So to keep in mind, and he might say this later, I read the first one, I started this, but I didn't get to finish it. So for decades now, the number of barrels we use per day, which right now I think is 106 million barrels a day, something like that. As long as the number of barrels per day is a few million barrels, like it's normally been about 4 million barrels over and above demand. So if we're using 106, that means demand is 102 million per day, okay? So as long as we have an excess of energy, okay, that's the key word right there. Excess of energy, excess supply. Everything is fairly hunky-dory. Going back to 2007, 2008, 2009, we experienced the fact that the millions of barrels per day fell. The excess fell. We were about 1 million barrels over demand. Supply was only about 1 million barrels over demand for a little while. Guess what happened? Fracking. Yes, that's when fracking was, they'd known about it and they'd been working on it forever. But they finally pushed because they knew we were having peak oil as far as conventional sweet crude goes. The oil we've been using for decades hit peak production. So when he's talking here, he's including all kinds of oil. And one of the terms I've read in the past, it's called extreme energy. The reason that we have to go in and crush rock to squeeze oil out of it, that's extreme. We've never had to do that. It takes more money. It takes more energy. Okay? It's called extreme energy. Let's see if he gets to that. Okay. As we have seen in part 1 of this series, there are several limits to global oil supply. First, Earth has a finite volume. Out of this finite volume, there are only so many places where oil can be formed and later found. The largest of these oil reserves have been already identified and tapped, and as they near the end of their useful life, we are forced to move towards ever smaller, ever more energy resource intensive to get deposits or tapping the source rock itself, think shale. Shale oil, that's shale oil. And then, of course, there's fracking for gas. Beyond that, there is very little we can do. We are now actively living up our civilization's lifetime savings at an exponential rate. As rich, easy-to-tap fields providing prodigious returns on investment slowly give up the ghost, the age of flexible yet reliable supply comes to an end. The persistent increase in energy and resource demand on drilling the next well and getting the next barrel, as we move on to tap ever trickier deposits, will require an even higher selling price to balance. The only problem is that oil prices above a certain point simply end up killing the host. Okay, so they're talking about the economy and what the economy can bear. Okay, that's a big deal. You have to figure that in. Despite being such a vital and irreplaceable input to the economy, petroleum's affordability will eventually put a chokehold on its own future. The cost of oil builds into every product you buy, every product, especially food, thereby leaving less and less money in your pocket to spend on other products and travel, both courtesy of petroleum. This process eventually decimates demand for both energy and raw materials, and at the same time limits investments in future oil production by putting a huge question mark over returns. At a certain point, which we might have already passed, new oil will become too expensive for buyers to buy, and at the same time too costly for producers to extract. All this is happening in real time in front of our eyes. In fact, we are well into this process since 2005, when conventional oil production peaked and humanity started to resort to ever more exotic forms of supply, fracked shale oil, tar sands, or ultra-heavy oil from Venezuela, to keep up at least a simulacrum of, I never saw that word, of growth. Since liquid fuels are indispensable to the economy, their production now gets massive subsidies. Yes, massive subsidies from other energy resources, be it drilling rigs powered by hydroelectric plants near the shores of Norway, or energy provided by coal, natural gas, and even renewables. Not to mention mixing biofuels into gasoline. Humanity throws everything at the issue in keeping the necessary amount of fuel flowing into the economy. Our situation is so dire. Okay? Our situation is so dire that temporarily we might even attempt breaking break-even levels for subsidizing hydrocarbon production investing more than a barrel of oil worth of energy into getting a barrel of fuel in return, thinking creating fuel from thin air or nuclear diesel. No kidding. Wow, haven't heard that one yet. A decline in net energy, however, does not affect oil alone. The same principles apply to all mineral resources. All mineral resources. So we're talking about renewable resources here that we need. Okay. From coal to natural gas, from uranium, yes, to lithium and even copper. As fat, easy to access deposits deplete, the next batch will be increasingly more energy intensive to get. Eventually, we will reach a point where the energy sources now used to subsidize liquid fuel production will themselves prove to be increasingly uneconomic and thus cease to be a subsidy. If you consider that liquid fuels feed back into the mining, production, and transferring of all forms of energy, yes, including renewables, hydro, and nuclear too, you will start to appreciate how this decline in net energy will see our high-tech era spiraling down the drain. Well, it kind of sucks being stuck on a finite planet, doesn't it? With that all said, it is worth keeping in mind, though, that peak oil is not a date beyond which we run out of oil, but a day beyond which we are no longer able to produce as much as before. Not a sudden apocalypse, but the onset of a long decline, something which can remain invisible for a relatively long period of time, as poorer regions of the world are silently giving up on most of their oil use and return to a much simpler local low-tech economy one by one. As the process unfolds, large swaths of our civilized populations will be forced to give up on car use and consumption of goods from faraway lands. Products of all kinds will become prohibitively expensive as the cost of mining, manufacturing, and transport goes up. Demand for oil will start to decline, not because we want it so, but because we will no longer be able to afford it. Is there a way out of this mess? Can alternative energy sources pull us out from this hole? Well, as we have seen above, relatively high, unaffordable oil prices also dampen demand for renewables through increasing mining and transportation costs, paradoxically making the energy transition itself impossible. This is a much more general and severe issue than most assume. No matter what technology we dream up, all of them require mining and transportation of raw materials at an immense scale. Now, add in that fact that we simply lack the actual copper and other mineral reserves, in addition to the lack of energy needed to get them. To electrify the world, you start to see that we have a serious math problem. And if we cannot build, let alone maintain, the necessary alternative infrastructure for the future, it really doesn't matter how we plan to power it. A shrinking oil supply, walking hand in hand with a faltering flow of minerals, and a death knell for the is a death knell for the consumer economy. I'm sorry. The long decline will leave us with an ever-shrinking market of high-end goods targeted towards the rich, leaving little to none for the poor and the working class, for a while at least, for the rich. As the process continues to unfold during the decades ahead, first slowly, then at an ever faster pace, expect an avalanche of bankruptcies, mass unemployment, a collapse of services, riots, and all what usually comes with political upheaval. What has happened to Sri Lanka during the recent years is a case in point. Gated communities with all the high tech one can imagine will continue to remain an escape hatch for the rich, while the rest of the population will have no other choice than to try to make a living from manual labor, growing food, and making simple low-tech products for local use. For those who could still afford it, renewables will temporarily provide at least some energy to access the internet, power some appliances, or pumping some water from wells. Since the basis of a global economy and trade will simply vanish with an ever lower oil production, replacing defunct wind turbines, solar panels, and batteries will first become challenging, then all but impossible. Got that? You can have a glimpse on how this might play out by listening to the story of Jocelyn Faith Keddy from Lebanon, a country where well ahead of us, well ahead of most of us into a post-petroleum world. A fascinating account, to say the least. I'll have to look that up. Jocelyn Faith, Kehdy. Oh, in the Western world, all this will be seen as a result of a series of economic crises, a financial market crash, a lack of liquidity, bad policies, evil dictators, people coming from far abroad, you name it. Everything but the real underlying cause, a faltering energy return on investment and resource depletion. This is why I do these videos, so that people know the underlying real reason, the root cause, instead of blaming the wrong people or the wrong thing for our problems. I'll read that again. In the Western world, all this will be seen as a result of a series of economic crises, a financial market crash, a lack of liquidity, bad policies, evil dictators, people coming from far abroad, you name it. So there you go. There's really not that much, and this has been caused by every single politician. You know, they've all known, at least most of the ones at the very top. They've known and they understand this. Some of them. Some of them aren't that smart. Everything that the real underlying cause of faltering energy return on investment and resource depletion. Okay. Consequently, governments will try to solve the problem by throwing an unprecedented amount of money at it, restricting competition as well as what's left from democracy itself, or by lowering environmental standards in sacrifice zones. Look that up if you don't know what that is. In order to get the last batch of resources. All this will achieve, though, is a further increase in inflation, political upheaval, pollution, and climate change until consumption finally breaks down and another wave of bankruptcies ushers in. The long decline is not all doom and gloom, however. I think it is. And there's a lot more going on here than just this. You know, you've got all this stuff going on with climate change and other things like massive soil depletion, etc. As Professor William E. Reese, the originator of the ecological footprint concept, put it in his recent paper, globalization and unfettered trade, dependence on distant elsewheres for food and many other resources will no longer be possible in the emerging resource climate constrained world. This is not entirely a bad thing. I just hope they have enough oil to take care of the nuclear power plants for a while. But the other problem with that is water. Okay. This is not entirely a bad thing. Globalization is a driver of overshoot. So-called free trade, particularly in the past half century, greatly accelerated resource overexploitation and pollution and facilitated population growth. It follows that adaptive eco-economies be more ecocentric local economies. It follows that adaptive eco-economies be more ecocentric local economies. Agriculture and essential light manufacturing, for example, food processing, textiles, clothing, furniture, tools, will all be relocalized, providing an ample, meaningful employment. There will be a resurgence of personal skills and pride in workmanship. As an immediate additional benefit, when citizens become acutely aware of their dependence on local ecosystems, they become more actively concerned about the health and integrity of those systems. A sense of conscious participation in one's eco niche is not possible if the relevant ecosystems are half a planet away. It is very important to understand that it was the use of fossil fuels in general and oil in particular which has enabled us to massively overshoot the carrying capacity of the earth and pollute nature beyond any tolerable level. Their use has ushered in climate change and wreaked havoc on entire ecosystems. But it was the advent of oil which has fueled and keeps fueling to this very day all the mining as well as all the intercontinental transportation of resources and products. It has enabled industrial agriculture to grow a previously unprecedented amount of food by giving us the power of diesel, as well as fertilizers and pesticides, because fertilizer is made with natural gas. Okay. Its unfettered use has eventually led to an even drawdown of all raw materials in nature alike, and left us with a massive predicament. With a relentlessly falling amount of oil production, though, the chickens will come home to roost. Humanity will soon have to come to terms with losing what Catton called, William Catton, the phantom carrying capacity. Okay, people say, oh, well, we've got 8 billion people, everybody's still doing halfway decent, pretty much, whatever. Here it is. Phantom carrying capacity, an end to human overshoot. Can this be a peaceful affair? One could argue that due to rapidly falling fertility rates, the rising cost of raising children, and deaths of despair, and with a massive generation of baby boomers leaving the scene, bye, hopefully not too soon, leaving the scene, this process could remain manageable, but it is too early to tell. The combined effects of an increasingly inadequate supply of oil, together with global temperatures soaring past 1.5 by 2030, then 2C by 2040, with an additional degree coming from the removal of aerosol masking effect, look that up, could easily accelerate civilizational decline beyond all imagination. Complex systems like ecosystems or the world economy has multiple tipping points beyond which things can easily get completely out of control, especially when people won't try to understand the problem and come up with all kinds of other scenarios and then get angry and do things they shouldn't be doing. One thing seems to be sure. By the time the last oil wells run out, no one will give a damn. Driving a car will be a distant memory in the past by then, as well as shopping for plastic gadgets in the supermarket or ordering something from the internet. The coming decline of oil extraction will force humanity to return to a one-planet living and wean itself off from its addiction to technology, presuming that there will be still a planet with a viable ecosystem to inhabit by then. The ensuing civilization decline in the following decades after peak oil will eerily resemble a radical tapering off cure. But as in the case of dropping any severe addiction, there is no guarantee for survival. Until next time, withdrawal can be a bitch. So, now, considering having read all that, what we might want to discuss is the fact that, okay, Capricorn, management of resources, we haven't done that, as we can see. So when Pluto moves into Aquarius, Aquarians like technology, and there's plenty of people at the very, very top that want to do like really some weird things, like, you know, put our consciousness in a computer and all that stuff. Well, you still need energy to run all that. And these big labs, big servers, these massive servers take massive amounts of energy. People, it's sci-fi. Okay. Reality is reality is reality. So Pluto through Capricorn. I've brought this up before. Pluto, transformation of who we think we are as a species. Aquarius being man, okay? Massive transformation of who we think we are, who we think we could be. You know, we've gone through this long technological progress, which really wasn't progress, in the way it would really count. But now, you know, even though it's too late and we might go, maybe now we can go through a transformation of sociological and cultural sorts. We can maybe, and it's not going to happen worldwide, and it's still going to be extremely messy. And I don't really think it's going to happen, sorry. But that's the symbolism of Pluto and Aquarius. We could come to terms with our ideals and be more humanitarian as we go down. Okay. There'll be places, there'll be people who do that. It's important for people to be aware that that's a possibility for themselves. It may not happen with all countries. It may not happen with your neighbor. Hopefully it does. Not only will people possibly move because of climate catastrophes in their area, which are never ending, but people may move because they either want to go back home to where they had lived when they were young, and now they want to be close to the people they, their family support system, or they move away from those people because, the place they grew up or the people they've been around just do not get it, and so they leave because they want to go somewhere where there's a support system, people that share their values and understanding of the world, okay? And they feel that, socially, they'll make out better there, okay? There's going to be all kinds of situations. There's going to be cults. Yes, technological cults, cults that go way back to nature, and people, when you have a cult, and I mean a cult, things really do get out of hand. But that's going to happen, I'm pretty sure. I mean, as we've seen in the past, and because people want everything to be back the way it used to be. People will think, oh no, technology, and they'll come up with this technological tribal or city or whatever you want to call it, and they'll draw people in. Come on, I still have power. You can come here and you can have internet and you can have, fun and stuff instead of working your butt off out in the field growing food. It's not going to be pretty, people. The key is to use mind over matter and empathy. In the United States with Pisces, I think I didn't finish that thought in the beginning. Pisces is in the third house, intercepted. So, transportation is vital to us. I mean, with Uranus ruling the third house, because Aquarius is there at like 28, 29 degrees, and the third house, of course, we used invention and technology to, have this massive technological transportation thing that we have here, right? But that's going to come down. It'll be slow. There is this idea of the Seneca Cliff, but that's probably still down the road a ways. But there will come a time when the energy production and then many other things, food production, will just go to off the cliff. And at that point, it's not a process anymore. It's an event. Within it, probably, I don't even know, a year or two or whatever, everything will just go to shit. But that might be a little ways down the road yet. But on top of all that, resource depletion and energy depletion, you've got the catastrophes of all sorts happening everywhere. And if you look into the state of the oceans, and I don't just mean loss of fish, etc. I'm talking about ocean stratification, which is bad. I mean, the fact that they don't mix anymore, the stratifications. We're not mixing enough, okay? They're slowing as far as that's concerned. Ocean acidification, the warming of oceans. So, that whole combination will affect people very negatively. So with that, I just want to say thank you for listening, and I want to try to do another one soon. So take care and start studying. Bye.